The blood evidence from Nicole Brown Simpson's condo was collected with absolute confidence. This was June of 1994, and for the LAPD criminalists on the scene, the case seemed straightforward. The suspect was obvious, the motive clear. They carefully gathered the samples, believing this would be the foundation of an open and shut conviction. But in that routine collection, a critical, almost invisible error occurred. A blood sample was placed into an unsealed evidence container. The immediate contamination was subtle, undetectable to the naked eye, but it was catastrophic. It was the first tiny crack in what would become a chasm of doubt. The brutal murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman sent shockwaves through the nation. The crime scene was one of overwhelming violence, and from the very beginning, the investigation had a single, glaring focus: O.J. Simpson, Nicole's famous ex-husband. The prosecution built their case around a modern marvel: DNA science. This was their smoking gun, the seemingly irrefutable evidence that would prove guilt beyond any shadow of a doubt. They operated under the illusion of scientific certainty, a belief that the cold, hard facts of genetics would make this a simple matter for the jury. But this case would ask a question that still echoes through courtrooms today. How could the most overwhelming DNA evidence imaginable fail to secure a conviction? The answer lies not in the science itself, but in the human hands that carried it. To understand the sheer weight of that DNA evidence, you first have to understand why O.J. Simpson was the perfect suspect. Nicole Brown Simpson's life was tragically marked by a history of domestic violence. Police had been called to their home multiple times, documenting a pattern of fear and control. O.J. Simpson wasn't just a suspect. He was a national icon, a beloved athlete, but also an ex-husband, with a clear, documented motive and the opportunity to commit the crime. The initial investigation seemed to confirm this at every turn. A trail of blood led investigators from the gruesome scene on Bundy Drive directly to Simpson's own estate. The collection of key DNA samples felt like a checklist for conviction. Blood on the rear gate at the crime scene, a bloody glove found on his property, and more blood in his Ford Bronco. For the LAPD, the theory was not just plausible, it was overwhelming. Every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed squarely at one man. This wasn't a case that required a deep search for a culprit. The culprit was presented by the evidence itself. The transition in the investigation was swift and decisive. They moved from building a strong circumstantial case to placing their entire faith in the emerging power of DNA science. They believed the lab results would simply be the final, unassailable layer of proof. The confidence was palpable. They had their man, and they had the science to prove it. But this reliance on a single type of evidence created a vulnerability. The case was becoming less about the narrative of the crime and more about the purity of the process. And the process, as they would soon discover, was far from pure. The very science they trusted would become the battlefield where the case was ultimately lost. Not on the question of what the DNA showed, but how it had been handled from the moment it was collected. This shift in focus, from the horror of the crime to the technicalities of evidence handling, is where the certainty began to unravel. The defense team recognized this vulnerability immediately. While the prosecution saw a mountain of evidence, the defense saw a mountain of opportunities to plant seeds of doubt. Their strategy would not be to prove Simpson's innocence, but to prove the evidence itself was untrustworthy. They began to dissect the chain of custody, looking for any break, any misstep, any moment where the integrity of a sample could be questioned. And in the early hours of the investigation, they found what they were looking for. The foundation of the case was built on sand. The prosecution's entire case rested on a simple legal concept: the chain of custody. This is the documented, unbroken path that physical evidence must follow from the moment it's collected at a crime scene to the moment it's presented in a courtroom. It's a procedural safeguard, a ledger of accountability designed to answer one critical question: can we be sure this evidence is exactly what the police say it is, and that it hasn't been tampered with, altered, or contaminated? For DNA evidence, this chain is everything. The science can tell you with near certainty whose blood is on a glove, but it cannot tell you how it got there. That's where the chain of custody comes in. It's the story that authenticates the science. In the Simpson case, the journey of the blood evidence was long and convoluted. The samples collected from the gate at Bundy Drive, from the infamous glove and from Simpson's Bronco, traveled from the hands of the initial criminalists into the LAPD's own laboratory and finally to the private labs where the actual DNA testing was performed. This journey should have been a model of meticulous documented precision. Instead, it became a catalog of errors. The critical moments of failure began almost immediately. Evidence bags were not properly sealed. Blood samples were left unrefrigerated for extended periods, sometimes in the trunks of patrol cars, allowing for degradation and potential bacterial growth. The documentation was sloppy. Logs had missing times, inconsistent descriptions, and gaps that defense attorneys would later characterize as opportunities for tampering. Why weren't these errors caught? The answer lies in a dangerous combination of procedural shortcuts and sheer overconfidence. They believed so completely in their theory of the case, in the obviousness of Simpson's guilt, that the handling of evidence became almost a formality. They were building a case against a man they were certain had committed the crime. The idea that someone might deliberately plant evidence, or that simple carelessness could create reasonable doubt, seemed far-fetched. This overconfidence blinded them to the fragility of their own process. They treated the evidence as proof of a conclusion they had already reached, rather than as the foundation of an argument they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal importance of any break in this chain cannot be overstated. In the American justice system, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They must demonstrate not just that the evidence points to guilt, but that the evidence itself is trustworthy. A single documented break, a single hour where a blood sample was unaccounted for, opens the door to alternative explanations. Maybe the sample was contaminated by an officer at the scene. Maybe it was accidentally switched with another sample in the lab. Or, as the defense would vehemently suggest, maybe it was deliberately planted to frame a guilty man. The chain of custody exists to eliminate these possibilities. When the chain is broken, those possibilities, however unlikely, become legally viable. They introduce doubt. And in a criminal trial, doubt is the prosecution's greatest enemy. This transition was the defense's masterstroke. They shifted the entire focus of the trial away from the brutal facts of the murder and onto the dry, technical details of police procedure. The case was no longer about what O.J. Simpson did on the night of June 12th. It was about what Detective Philip Venenatter did on a vial of blood on June 13th. The courtroom battle moved from the emotional realm of a double murder into the clinical world of evidence logs, storage protocols, and laboratory standards. The prosecution found themselves in an impossible position, defending the LAPD's sloppy work instead of presenting their powerful scientific results. The chain of custody, a concept most jurors had never heard of before the trial, became the central character in the drama. It was the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel the entire tapestry of the state's case. The DNA results themselves were devastating for the defense on the surface. Testing confirmed that blood drops at the crime scene matched O.J. Simpson's DNA profile. Blood found in his Bronco and on a sock in his bedroom matched the profiles of both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. From a purely scientific standpoint, the case was airtight. This is where the defense's strategy became brilliant in its cynicism. They did not attack the science of DNA testing itself. That would have been a losing battle. Instead, they attacked the integrity of the samples that were tested. Their argument was simple: garbage in, garbage out. If the evidence entered into the testing process was contaminated, mishandled, or tampered with, then the results, no matter how scientifically precise, were meaningless. They put the LAPD's crime lab on trial. The legal battle that ensued was a masterclass in creating reasonable doubt. The defense team, led by the flamboyant Johnny Cochran, systematically dismantled the prosecution's forensic case. They highlighted every misstep in the chain of custody. They called attention to the unrefrigerated blood sample that Simpson had given as a reference, which a criminalist had carried around for hours before booking it into evidence. They questioned why the quantity of blood drawn from Simpson seemed to be more than what was eventually accounted for in the lab. They presented a narrative not of an incompetent investigation, but of a corrupt one, suggesting the LAPD was so desperate to convict Simpson that they were willing to fabricate evidence. This strategy reached its iconic moment with the glove demonstration. The prosecution asked Simpson to try on the leather glove found at his estate, a glove stained with the victim's blood. It didn't fit. Cochran's simple, memorable refrain to the jury, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," wasn't just about a glove.
It was a metaphor for the entire case. It suggested that the evidence itself had been manipulated, that it was a poor fit for the narrative the prosecution was trying to force. The prosecution's dilemma was profound. They were armed with valid, powerful science, but it had been compromised by the sloppy procedure of the very people who collected it. They had to spend countless hours defending the LAPD's actions, explaining away inconsistencies, and trying to convince the jury that, while the process was imperfect, the conclusion was still sound. This put them in a weak rhetorical position. Instead of being the champions of scientific truth, they became the apologists for police error. Every minute spent explaining a paperwork discrepancy was a minute not spent describing the horror of the murders. The DNA evidence, which was meant to be their trump card, became a liability because it was inextricably linked to the flawed system that produced it. The immediate effect of this strategy was the creation of overwhelming reasonable doubt. The jury was no longer asked to decide if O.J. Simpson killed two people. They were asked to decide if the Los Angeles Police Department could be trusted. In the context of the recent Rodney King beating and the widespread distrust of the LAPD within the African American community, this was a question that resonated deeply. The defense successfully framed the trial as a referendum on police integrity rather than a murder case. The scientific certainty of the DNA was drowned out by the louder, more emotional question of institutional racism and corruption. The public reaction to the acquittal revealed a nation divided along stark lines. For many, the acquittal was a stunning failure of justice, a case where a clearly guilty man had escaped punishment on a legal technicality. For others, it was a long overdue indictment of a racist and corrupt police system. The division was not just about the facts of the case, but about lived experience and deep-seated distrust of authority. The trial ceased to be about two individuals in a courtroom and became a national Rorschach test, reflecting back whatever beliefs about race, class, and justice the viewer brought to it. The question of whether justice was served or evaded depends entirely on which story you believed: the story of a brutal murder or the story of a police frame-up. The legal system delivered a verdict, but it provided no closure because the trial had become about something much larger than the guilt or innocence of one man. The Simpson verdict exposed a fundamental flaw in the justice system. Procedural integrity is the bedrock upon which scientific truth is built. When that foundation cracks, even the most compelling evidence collapses. The case wasn't lost on the science of DNA, but on the human element of its handling. It revealed a dangerous conflict between scientific certainty, which deals in probabilities, and the legal standard of proof, which demands moral certainty. For the investigators who had worked the case, the acquittal was a profound psychological blow, a feeling that a truth they knew intimately had been rendered legally irrelevant by their own mistakes. The lingering question is whether the system failed the victims by prioritizing process over substance, or if that strict adherence to process is precisely what protects us all from a different kind of injustice. Can we ever truly know what happened that night? Or has the truth been permanently obscured by the very system designed to reveal it? The acquittal was based entirely on reasonable doubt about the evidence handling, leaving two brutal murders with no one held legally responsible. The case revealed a haunting truth, that procedure, can undermine even scientific certainty. If you want to explore more cases where the gap between truth and justice remains unresolved, or very educative fictional stories that cut through both entertainment and moral lessons, kindly subscribe to our channel and always remember to like, comment, and share to help create social awareness.